Welcome. This is the second lecture in our spring lecture series, although it doesn't feel much like spring this evening. But I'd like to welcome you all to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and introduce you to Jim OConnell, who's the newest member of the Hui Sea Grant staff. Jim joined our staff in February of 1999 after an illustrious career with both Coastal Zone Management of Massachusetts and the Cape Cod Commission. And Jim is taking up many of the same interests that Graham Geis brought to our program. Graham retired at the end of last year, and I think you'll see from this evening, Jim has some great experience with coastal issues in Massachusetts, and he's going to share a number of his insights and expertise in these areas with us this evening. So we're going to share with Jim over the next hour a tour of coastal landforms of Massachusetts, some of the problems and some of the solutions, to protecting our coastal landforms. So Jim?
Thank you all for coming. Erosion, flooding, and coastal storms wreak havoc along our shoreline. They destroy our natural resources, and they put shoreline homes and other structures in jeopardy, thereby putting the economic vitality of our coastal communities in jeopardy. True or false? Seawalls prevent erosion.
False.
True or false? I may as well go home. In order to truly answer those questions, one must have a fundamental understanding of physical coastal processes. And what I mean by physical coastal processes is that complex interaction between winds, waves, tides, longshore sediment transport, shoreline change, erosion, accretion, and human activities to control those processes. So what I'd like to do for some of you tonight is to give you that basic, fundamental, qualitative understanding of physical coastal processes and describe human attempts to control those processes, and all the while taking you for a tour of the spectacular beauty that we find as we walk along our shoreline today. In order to gain an appreciation for the beauty and the spectacular forms that we see as we walk along the shoreline today, we need to go back in time. And we need to go back approximately 15 to 20,000 years ago. At that time, the last continental glaciation reached its southern maximum, the Wisconsin glaciation. This slide shows the Massachusetts shoreline, the North Shore, the Boston area, the South Shore, Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. This dotted line that you see here on the bottom of the slide denotes the southern maximum of that last Wisconsin glaciation, approximately 15 to 20,000 years ago. As you can see, it reached Montauk, it reached Martha's Vineyard, and it reached Nantucket. You'll notice this other dotted line here. Approximately 15,000 years ago, the climate began to change. And when the climate began to change, the glaciers began to melt. And when the glaciers began to melt, they began to recede, they began to move back. But when they reached their southern maximum, they stopped there for a long period of time. And when glaciers stopped for a long period of time, on their way down here, they picked up massive amounts of materials: silt, clay, sand, cobble, boulders the size of automobiles, entrained in the ice. So when they stopped for long periods of time, for example, at the terminal moraine area of this glaciation, they began to drop a lot of this material. That material actually formed the backbone of Martha's Vineyard and formed the backbone of Nantucket. As the glaciers receded, they stopped again for a long period of time, denoted by this dotted line here. dropping, again, massive amounts of material that we call the recessional moraine. Now, the glaciers came and they went repeatedly, but where they stopped for long periods of time. At that time, there were 3 ice lobes: the Buzzards Bay lobe, the Cape Cod Bay lobe, and the South Channel lobe. Where we find some of the most spectacular landforms that we see as we walk along the shoreline today in terms of relief or elevation are along these areas where the glaciers stopped for long periods of time and where these 3 lobes came together, as you can see here, and as you can see here. For example, the Gay Head Cliffs of Martha's Vineyard, which were actually laid down by a succession of repeated glaciations in interglacial periods. Some of the oldest deposits that we find are actually at the base of the Gay Head Cliffs in Martha's Vineyard following storms. If we move to the eastern shore of Nantucket, we find beautiful sea cliffs, approximately 100 or so feet high. That was the area of the dotted line between the South Channel lobe and the Cape Cod Bay lobe. I want you to keep this little piece of apparatus in mind here for later on in the talk. If we move over to the western shore of Cape Cod Bay, where the Buzzards Bay moraine and the Cape Cod moraine came together, where you saw that dotted line where they came together, again, we see these beautiful, spectacular cliffs down in the Cedarville areas of South Plymouth. This area up here is a state park. That's actually accessible off Route 3A, probably 10 or 15-minute drive from the bridge. It's called Ellisville State Park, where you can actually access these cliffs. At low tide, you can walk across that channel and walk along and see these beautiful cliffs. The Cape Cod National Seashore, which was at the interface between the South Channel lobe and the Cape Cod Bay lobe. Research by scientists here at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and elsewhere actually determined by seismic profiling and other scientific methodologies that these bluffs actually extended out some 3 to 4 miles seaward than they do today when the glaciers began to melt and began to recede. These are part of the interlobate moraine out here and in the outwash plains that grade into Cape Cod Bay as we move towards the west. We have fluvial glacial deposits. These are came deposits that we find on the eastern shore of Cape Cod Bay in the town of Wellfleet in Great Island. Again, another publicly accessible site. These have coarse-grained sands which provide massive amounts of material for our intertidal areas and our beaches. We have thousands of drumlins, primarily on the north shore and on the south shore, but these are these whaleback type formations, sort of an inverted spoon. And you can see the type of material that has eroded out of this drumlin. This is what we call a boulder platform. And it's obvious that this drumlin at one point protruded out into the sea some considerable distance. This is Gurnet Point at the south end of Duxbury Beach, actually in the town of Plymouth. This lighthouse here was just relocated approximately 200 feet landward just last year. And of course we have a number of bedrock outcrops, primarily on the north shore, some on the south shore. We don't see any on Cape Cod, but there are a number in Buzzards Bay and down in Rhode Island as well. This is the Cohasset shoreline on the south shore of Massachusetts. Now, at the time when the glaciers began to recede, they were somewhere approximately a mile thick. And the water that made those glaciers primarily came from the ocean. So the sea level was some 300 to 400 feet lower than it was today. There was actually a land connection. You could walk out to Martha's Vineyard. You could walk out to Nantucket. You could walk out to Georges Bank. And we know that from some of the terrestrial organisms and other evidence that some of the fishermen have pulled up in their nets, as well as some of the coring devices that the scientists here at Woods Hole have pulled up over the years. But as sea level began to rise, it began to inundate a lot of these primary glacial deposits. And as it began to inundate these deposits, they began to erode and provide massive amounts of material into what we call the littoral zone, that beach and nearshore zone. The material, this is the Cape Cod National Seashore, striper fishing last fall. This is in the town of Truro. So the sand that comes from the erosion of these bluffs ends up in front of the bluffs. The primary source that feeds our beaches and dunes today comes from the erosion of these primary deposits, these glacial uplands, again, the Cape Cod National Seashore. But the sand that's in front of these beaches, not all of it came from this bluff. It came from somewhere updrift. And to understand where the sand comes from and where the sand goes, we need to talk about these physical coastal processes, and we need to begin somewhere in a cycle. And I'll begin that cycle with the wind. As the wind blows on the surface of the water, it creates friction, as well as low pressure, which elevates the sea surface. Wind-generated waves are the most common types of waves we see on the surface today, but as the wind blows, it creates wind-generated waves. Now, very rarely does a wave hit the shoreline straight on or perpendicular. It almost always hits the shoreline at some angle. And when a wave hits the shoreline at an angle, it sets up a momentum of water going in the opposite direction that the wind is coming from. Much like if I had a ball in my hand and I threw it at the screen at an angle, the ball would end up bouncing and hitting the other wall, but the momentum would be going in the opposite direction. It's the same thing with the waves. When the waves hit at an angle, they create a movement of water called the longshore current. And in that current moves sand, and under storm conditions, moves cobble. It's what we call longshore sediment transport, or longshore drift. This is an example. The waves hitting at an angle are creating a longshore current, and thus longshore sediment transport is from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen as you face it. This is Wingasheek Beach up in the North Shore. So the sand that came from this bluff here, this bluff is actually in the town of Truro, just about in this location up in here. So the sand that comes out of this bluff, coming from Truro, because of our predominant northeast winds, predominant direction being the direction that the strongest winds come out of during the year, that's from the northeast direction. Because of the curvature of the shoreline, the northeast winds come down, remove the sand from this bluff here, and actually transport it south, and in some cases transport it north, primarily because of the curvature of the shoreline. In this area here is what we call a nodal point. A nodal point is a divergence of currents, or a divergence in water movement and thus longshore sediment transport. So the erosion from those bluffs can either travel south, it can travel north. In this particular case, a lot of that material coming from Truro is actually traveling south down past the Cape Cod National Seashore and was responsible for forming the barrier beaches farther south, such as Nauset Beach that we see here. This is the breach in Chatham that occurred in 1987. But this sand here that formed Nauset Beach, as well as Monomoy Island, much of that sand came from the erosion of those glacial uplands. Some of it came from the erosion of our offshore areas as well, but much of it today comes from the erosion of those glacial uplands through that longshore sediment transport process, creating this barrier beach as well as 681 other barrier beaches in the Commonwealth. Through primarily that same process. Those bluffs in Truro were here. So that bluff transports sand down here, forms Nauset Beach, Monomoy Island, as well as erosion from some of the nearshore areas. It's responsible for forming many of our barrier beaches, such as Duxbury Beach. That drumlin that I showed you at Gurnet Point was located right here. But Duxbury Beach, Saquesh Head, Plymouth Long Beach, again we have a reversal of our longshore sediment transport. The northeast storms come and they hit these bluffs here, and we actually have a reversal of longshore sediment transport moving north. So forming Long Beach, Sandy Neck and Barnstable, many of the barrier beaches that we see on the south side of Martha's Vineyard, on Nantucket, almost all of these barrier beaches formed from that longshore sediment transport. So we have erosion of our glacial uplands, deposition of that material, it gets picked up by these longshore currents and moved along in the longshore sediment transport or littoral drift system, forming our barrier beaches and beaches. And 681 barrier beaches owe their origin primarily to the erosion of these uplands and that transport of this material. Now, as an example, we'll move back over to the western shore of Cape Cod Bay. This is the Cedarville area of Plymouth. You can see these beautiful, beautiful bluffs, these beautiful glacial deposits. Down here you can see the stack of the Cape Cod Canal. Much to the chagrin of these property owners, the bluffs are eroding, and they're eroding at approximately 1 foot per year on average. We know that they don't erode at 1 foot per year, they generally pulse in series of erosions and slump, but approximately 1 foot per year. But this material eroding from this bluff is moving southward down past the Cape Cod Canal, and it was responsible for forming Sandy Neck. Now this is what that barrier beach of Sandy Neck looked like approximately 3,000 years ago. Now through this longshore sediment transport process, the sand continually adds to the distal end of this barrier beach, called spit accretion. This is what it looked like 3,000 years ago. Now these brown deposits and these orange deposits are tidal flats and salt marshes primarily. But as this barrier beach continued to elongate from the erosion and the transport of that material, what you get is this beautiful estuary and the beginning growths of salt marshes and intertidal areas. This is what it looked like approximately 1,800 years ago, and this is approximately what it looks like today. Without the erosion of those glacial uplands, without the transport of that material, we wouldn't have this barrier beach and the incredible productive estuary, salt marsh, and tidal flats that owe their existence to these barrier beaches. Some of the most productive areas that we know in the world lie in some of these estuaries, nursery grounds for our commercial fishing, shell fishing, and so forth, owe their existence to these processes. This is what Sandy Neck looks like from the air, and you can see the extensive dune fields, the salt marsh that form behind it, little tidal creeks, and further down is Barnstable Harbor, all owing their existence to longshore sediment transport as a result of the erosion of these glacial uplands. The aesthetics, the wildlife habitat, the recreational value, as well as the storm damage prevention and flood control from storms afforded to the landward areas, in addition to the biological processes, all owe their existence to these simple yet complex processes. Not all of our barrier beaches in the Commonwealth are sandy barrier beaches. Some of them are cobble deposits. We see a lot of cobble deposits primarily on the North Shore and some of them on the South Shore. This happens to be Man Hill Beach in the town of Scituate on the South Shore. These cobble deposits are deposited as a result of storm wave activity. I've scuba dived off this area here in approximately 30 to 50 feet of water, and you would find anywhere from 20 to 40 to 50 foot piles of these cobble offshore that get primarily transported towards the land during these storms. These were storm deposits were studied by Dr. Rosens and Fitzgerald from Boston University and Boston College on a barrier beach that's just slightly north of there to see whether or not they would function similarly to sandy barrier beaches, and they don't. They function somewhat different. They have a tendency more to move landward than they do for some of the sandy deposits, which I'll explain in just a moment. So now we have this erosion of the glacial uplands, the transport of the material, the creation of our beaches, barrier beaches, dunes, and productive estuaries and salt marshes and so forth. But we also have sand transport on and offshore. So we have it alongshore, but we also have it on and offshore. And let me explain that mechanism. If you follow this dotted line, this is what a dune looked like before the storm occurred. So you have a pre-storm dune profile. Now during a storm, the waves become steep. And the period of the waves becomes shorter. Now, a wave period is the time it takes two successive wave crests to pass a stationary point. Now, as a result of storms, the waves get steeper, the period becomes shorter somewhat, and what happens is that creates a clawing type action. And the sand from the dune, from many dune and soft, unconsolidated deposits, is moved offshore to form a storm bar. Well, that storm bar, in turn, trips the storm wave energy, the initial storm wave energy, thus reducing the wave energy hitting the shoreline after that storm bar forms. So it gets into what we call a dynamic equilibrium. I think all of these physical coastal processes are in what we call a dynamic equilibrium. They're striving towards an equilibrium but never quite make it. They're all in a dynamic or a moving type equilibrium. Now following the storm, the waves become less steep. And as a result, this storm bar actually begins to move landward. And it will begin to move landward, and it will eventually weld itself back on shore. This was an aerial photograph, a low-altitude photograph that I had taken about 4 days after the October 1991 Northeast storm, the Halloween or no-name Northeast storm, which was a presidential declaration of disaster. This is Duxbury Beach on the South Shore. This is the Powder Point Bridge. You can see that the storm bars, just approximately a week after that storm, had already begun their migration landward. Note also these little discolored areas in between these sandbars. This is one of the primary mechanisms of how rip currents are formed. When the waves overtop these longshore bars, these storm bars, it creates a hydraulic head in behind it. And as you know, dunes are not linear, at least natural dunes are not. Man-made dunes oftentimes are, but there's undulations in the dunes. So when the water overtops these longshore storm bars, it'll find a low point in that offshore bar, and when it finds a low point, it will rush out. And that's one of the primary mechanisms for rip current formation. So you can see that the storm bar is pretty much on its way towards that beach to weld itself onto the beach. Eventually it will weld itself on the beach, and that's where the wind processes or the aeolian processes take over. Then they will pick up the finer grains and start blowing the material back up onto the beach, and it'll reform those dunes. Oftentimes they'll reform the dunes in the same location. Sometimes they'll form the 4 dunes slightly more landward than they had before the storm, depending really on the intensity of the storm. This is Long Beach on the South Shore in the town of Plymouth. Those same processes that I had just mentioned about the storm bar moving on and offshore also occur seasonally. In the wintertime, because of the frequency of storms we have and that same mechanisms of those steep waves, oftentimes you'll see a lower beach profile and you'll see a sandbar, one or more sandbars or storm bars will be retained offshore, primarily throughout the entire winter season. Again, tripping that storm wave energy in a sort of dynamic equilibrium, thereby when it gets into that equilibrium, breaking some of the wave energy offshore rather than onshore. And in the summertime, that offshore bar will migrate landward and you'll see it weld itself onshore. If you walk along the beaches today, on some of the beaches, you'll actually begin to see that process occurring now. Wrexham Beach in the town of Marshfield, you can actually see that bar has already come pretty much landward and it's all about to weld itself onto the shore. It's a process that takes place seasonally just about every year. The only time you would lose that material really would be during a really intense storm, such as a blizzard of 1978, for example, when that storm bar forms so far offshore that some of it may not return to shore, resulting in a long-term erosion. Just as a demonstration of this process, this seasonal process, this is Duxbury Beach, again on the South Shore. These slides were just provided to me last week from the Conservation Administrator, Joe Grady, in the town of Duxbury. But you'll notice this sign in the Jeep there. This is the winter profile. This is that same sign, different Jeep, same sign, but you can see the incredible buildup of the dune sands, just seasonally. This was taken in October, the other one was taken in early April. Can you go back again? Oftentimes when you walk along the beach in the wintertime, you'll see a lot of cobble. And then come the springtime, if folks are down on the beach before this recovery has taken place, this equilibrium has taken place, oftentimes people will think the sand's not going to return, but wait a little while. Oftentimes it will. And it really depends a lot on the updrift sediment supply as well, which I'll get into in a minute. Pretty astounding in some locations. Relative sea level rise is also a process that we need to factor into our planning to live along the shore. The scientists at the Oceanographic Institution here had done studies years ago, and they documented that the relative sea level rise rate in Massachusetts is approximately 1 vertical foot per 100 years. And when I say relative sea level rise, I mean the eustatic or worldwide sea level is rising approximately 4 to 6 inches. Then why is relative sea level rise in Massachusetts a foot? It's because the land mass in Massachusetts is also sinking. It's sinking because we were on the peripheral edge of that Wisconsin glaciation and there was a bulging up of the landform. As a result of the bulging up, the landform is sinking. It's basically trying to seek an equilibrium, a flat surface. So the difference between the landform sinking and the eustatic sea level rise results in approximately 1 vertical foot per 100 years of sea level rise. And what that means for some of this shoreline development is really questionable. This is the Cut River in Green Harbor in the town of Marshfield on the South Shore. I'm not sure how many years they have left, but they've got several years to enjoy themselves. As Warren Pilkey used to say, you shouldn't be able to fish from your front door. Also, many of our low-lying areas. This is Brant Rock. This happens to be the neighborhood that I live in, although I don't live in this. I live on a glacial upland about 25 feet above sea level, but I do have to come through this to get to my house. A lot of the low-lying areas. This was once a barrier beach, a sandy barrier beach that was developed, I would like to think, before we knew better. It's protected by an earthen dike on one side and a vertical concrete seawall on the other, but the earthen dike is only about 4 feet high. So as a result of a lot of these low-lying roads, we're going to have to do some future planning as a result of relative sea level rise. It looks like this person should have a no-wake sign there. I walked through this area after the October 1991 storm. After I realized what was happening, I was in Chatham, and I realized I had to get home. And I walked along the central portion, which is elevated by about a foot on an island, and I was actually chest deep in water. But I made it home after a stop at the local bar. But the state police wouldn't let us through. They forced me. But also, increased erosion rates as a result of relative sea level rise. Some areas that had not been inundated before in the future may see accelerated erosion rates because of the sea level rise if there's not an adequate sediment supply being fed to their beaches. This is Peggotty Beach in the town of Scituate, again on the South Shore. So erosion, let's just very quickly. The erosion of our glacial uplands is today the primary sediment source of our beaches, dunes, and barrier beaches. Without our barrier beaches, we wouldn't have many of the estuaries and the bays and the productive salt marshes and tidal flats that we see today. So erosion can actually be a beneficial process. The dilemma that we find in Massachusetts and elsewhere around the country, if not the world, is we have existing development that's been there for decades, if not hundreds of years, that was built long before we realized or understood coastal processes. This is Spring Hill Beach in the town of Sandwich, just a few days after the December 1992 storm, which was another presidential declaration of disaster. It's a barrier beach. Barrier beach defined as a sandy or cobbled deposit backed by either a wetland or a water body. So you can see all the houses along Spring Hill Beach are in pretty serious condition. What do we do in a situation like this? There are two. We have proactive mechanisms and we have reactive mechanisms. Proactive mechanisms are for those areas that are not developed, areas where we have a chance, now that we understand a lot about physical coastal processes. We understand shoreline change, and we have documented the shoreline change rates in Massachusetts over the last 140 years. But from a reactive mode to deal with the existing development, we really have three choices. We have hard stabilization, soft stabilization, or relocation or retreat. Let's take a look at some of our responses along the shoreline. I was fortunate to run into this postcard in a little shop on the Scituate waterfront. It was postmarked August of 1913. This is Third Cliff. It's a drumlin deposit. This is Peggotty Beach, the area that I just showed you where there were houses on stilts. Those houses on stilts, by the way, were all on solid foundations before the blizzard of 1978. They went on stilts as a result of certain requirements by the federal, state, and local governments, which I'll get into in just a minute. But I was fortunate to find this. As you can see, this drumlin deposit has a serious erosion problem, again, much to the chagrin of the property owners on top, and they didn't want to lose their property. So they had choices. They could relocate the structures, or they could armor the landform. And what they chose was that they armored the landform, and this is what it looks like today. They've lost their sandy beach, but they've stabilized the bluff, and all the homes here now have been rebuilt, if not expanded, and so forth. So it's a balance, it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off between beaches, if it's a primary sediment supply, or protecting people's upland properties. This was actually built back in between the 30s and 40s and has been reconstructed a number of times over the years by the state with the help from the local government. But by armoring that bluff was also the sediment supply to this downdrift area, Peggotty Beach. They also armored the other bluff on the other side, which is Third Cliff. Between those two sediment supplies, they've cut off a significant source to maintain the viability of this barrier beach. And as you can see, all these houses that were on stilts now had been inundated by a number of storms. Barrier beaches that are narrow enough for the sediment to go from the seaward side to the landward side are primarily migrating landward as a result of sea level rise and overwash deposits. That's exactly what's happening with this barrier beach here. So it has a slightly accelerated erosion rate, but it's also migrating landward as a result of natural causes. But by chopping off the sediment supply or reducing the sediment supply of this beach is accelerating the erosion rate. All of these houses, except for two on the front row, were purchased several years ago by the federal government. They determined it was less expensive for them to purchase the properties than to continue expending relief monies, not only on the federal level, but the state and local level as well. And they've turned it over for public property. Now, all these coastal engineering structures that we built over the years along the South Shore, we built extensive miles of vertical concrete seawalls as retaining walls back between the 30s and the 50s. They are repeatedly getting inundated with stronger waves as a result of sea level rise and as a result of erosion. An erosion, a shoreline change analysis conducted by the CZM office when I was there just a couple of years ago revealed that overall the Massachusetts shore is eroding at approximately 1/2 foot per year on average. Now there's some communities that are eroding, some that are accreting, but overall we're eroding at approximately 1/2 foot per year. And as a result of sea level rise, erosion, and armoring our sediment sources, many of these coastal engineering structures are now being inundated with higher energies that they weren't designed to withstand. And as a result, sometimes they hold up and sometimes they don't. This is Humrock Beach in the town of Scituate after the October 1991 Halloween or no-name storm. Sometimes our attempts will work for a period of time, sometimes they won't. But we have an engineering discipline as well, and we can rebuild these walls, which we oftentimes do. This wall was actually rebuilt after the blizzard of 1978. I've been walking these beaches for that long, photographing beaches and dunes and walls and so forth, and here's my wife down here for scale in 1978. But we can rebuild these walls, and we continue to rebuild these walls, but we do have to decide if there's a point, and at some point we may have to choose the third option, which may be relocation or retreat. But at what point is the question. So let's go over some of the impacts of some of these coastal engineering structures. This was out of the Journal of Coastal Research by Nick Krause from the Corps of Engineers and others, but he drew a little drawing of what the primary impacts of some of these structures are. The primary impact is the retention of the primary source of the material that feeds our beaches, dunes, and barrier beaches. But also, as to shorelines, obviously you're going to build a coastal engineering structure to usually to protect a building or protect an important road. But the first thing is you're going to cut off a certain amount of sediment supply to the beach. And you're oftentimes going to build it on an eroding shoreline. So the shoreline on either side of it will probably continue to erode. And as it does, there's a few impacts. So one is retention of that material, and I think that's probably one of the primary ones. But also, as the shorelines erode on either side, it could cause a growing type effect. And I'll get into a growing type effect in just a minute, but that's just a retention of material coming from the updrift side as the sand is traveling along in that longshore sediment transport process. Oftentimes you'll find an accelerated erosion, what we call scour or end effects of some of these structures on the downdrift side of these walls. Now, I've been walking beaches for many years, and I've seen it sometimes, and I haven't seen it in others. So sometimes you'll see that flanking, sometimes you won't, but oftentimes that's somebody else's property, because they're going to build a seawall only to the property line. So you'll end up with a little flanking effect. Also, in some cases, a scour trough had been noticed. In other words, particularly with vertical walls, we really don't build a lot of vertical concrete walls anymore because of the reflection factor. When a wave hits a vertical wall, there's energy reflected down and there's energy reflected up. The energy that's reflected down tends to cause a scouring effect at the base of the wall. And in some cases, not all cases, in some cases it's been documented that a scour trough forms. But it generally fills in very quickly, and oftentimes fills in before the storm has even completed itself, has finished. So the scour trough sort of accelerates the movement of that material relative to natural conditions. And theoretically, in laboratory tests, they've come up with another mechanism for possible rip cover formation, but that really hasn't been proven in the field as of yet. So if we go back to the Cape Cod National Seashore in the Pamit area of Truro, this was my striper fishing morning again. When we look at these areas, Graham Geis and others here at the Oceanographic Institution several years ago did a calculation, a study of the national seashore, the amount of material that was coming from these bluffs, the amount of material that was coming from the erosion of the translation of this whole beach profile landward as that landform continued to erode, did a calculation that if you were to armor the Cape Cod National Seashore in its entirety, the beaches would disappear in less than 100 years. And that's pretty significant, although we certainly wouldn't anticipate that to happen. But just as a demonstration of how important the material is from these glacial upland, as well as the material that's eroding from the offshore as that whole profile moves landward. Now, when you're looking at a beach profile, you're not just looking at the dry beach that ends at the low water. The beach profile actually continues into the nearshore zone out to, in some cases, the approximate 25 to 30 foot bathymetric contour. In other words, that's the sand sharing system between storms, the nearshore bars, them migrating landward. So that sand sharing system actually continues out some considerable distance, and it can go out as far as the 25 to 30 foot bathymetric contour. That's the beach system. Overwash processes. This is Plymouth Long Beach again, just several days after that October 1991 storm. This is Plymouth Long Beach in the town of Plymouth. You can see these overwash deposits. These are all remnant overwash deposits from the blizzard of 1978. When you get an overwash deposit, basically the material coming from the front beach washing over the barrier as a result of wave activity and sea level rise, it creates a substrate that forms new dunes, or salt marshes. You can see these new overwash areas here, which had formed as a result of the October 1991 storm. If you were to prevent that overwash from occurring by, for example, armoring the front part of this Barrier Beach and preventing the overwash, I would suggest you would significantly contribute to the demise of the Barrier Beach in terms of time. Just draw a line and eliminate all these overwash fans. It would obviously thin or narrow the Barrier Beach. With relative sea level rise, if you were to armor the front side, the beach on the front side would disappear. That would prevent dunes from forming, which would also prevent the seawall, may also prevent these overwash materials from occurring. Let's go down on the ground. This is Plymouth Long Beach. This is the south side of the Barrier Beach. Here's a dike, three-sided dike that was actually built after the Portland gale of 1898 by the Corps of Engineers over concern that the Barrier Beach was not going to stay intact and provide the protection it's been providing to the mainland of Plymouth, which has been around, as you well know, for a long period of time. But this is a dike that they built. You can see, as a result, there's no dune formation. This is a Barrier Beach, a sandy Barrier Beach. As a result, the sand, the aeolian processes, that wind-blown sands, can't get up over the dike to reform those dunes. As a result, you can see, as a result of storms, the barrier is actually continuing to migrate as waves overtop that, and it's starting to separate from the dike now. But halfway down the dike, for some reason, the Corps of Engineers jogged the dike towards the land into the central part of the dunes. Probably that was the shape of the Barrier Beach after that Portland gale of 1898. So if you turn around, walk down a little bit further, walk a little bit north on this dike, and turn around and look at the area where there was no dike. This is the northern part of the Barrier Beach. The dike is actually behind these dunes here, but you can see that that's the dune formation, the aeolian processes continuing to build those dunes. This was after a storm, I believe it was the December 1994 storm on Plymouth Long Beach. Now you remember the longshore sediment transport process. What happens if you build a shore perpendicular structure, such as a jetty or a groin, and you interrupt that longshore sediment transport process? These are groins. They're generally built of riprap, but in quiescent areas such as bays and estuaries, they can be built of metal, they can be built of wood, but you primarily find groins built of riprap. Now groins, the difference between groins and jetty is really in its function. They're generally built of the same material. A groin is built perpendicular to build up a beach, to trap that longshore sediment transport, primarily to build up a beach. A jetty is built at the entrance to a bay, a tidal channel, to keep the tidal channel open. So it's just really a matter of function, whether it's a groin or a jetty. But you can see that it's going to trap the longshore sediment transport and build up the beach on one side and erode it on the other side. Not necessarily erode it, but you almost always find a little shadow effect on the downdrift side of a groin. In other words, when the groin is filled to entrapment, some of the sand then will begin to bypass that. But as it bypasses it, it generally goes downdrift some distance and then comes ashore. But it almost always loses something on that downdrift side. That's what we call a shadow effect. And there is a planning mechanism of either shortening, lowering, or even making these groins a little bit more permeable to allow the sand, some sand, to migrate through that to help that shoreline be in a little bit more of an equilibrium. Oftentimes, when a groin is built, it results in other groins downdrift being built as well, and you end up with a groin field. A perfect example is the south side of Cape Cod. This is Pomponetset. This is the town of Mashpee. This is Pomponetset Beach. And the reason why I chose this is not only to show the groins, but also the effects of what it can do to the downdrift barrier beaches. You can see the direction of the longshore sediment transport just by the buildup of these groins. But don't be fooled. You've got to really do an analysis over the complete seasons of the year, because the longshore sediment transport is really based on the wind, which moves the waves, which moves the sediment. So if you have wind coming from an opposite direction, it's going to transport the sand in the opposite direction as well. So you've really got to do a complete yearly, if not longer, analysis to determine what the net movement of sand is, in which direction. And from there you can do planning practices and determine what side of your property you should build your groin on. Heaven forbid you build it on the wrong side. But in Pomponetset Beach, there is a little disagreement in the scientific community of whether or not these groins and downdrift armoring of the sediment source was really responsible for moving this barrier beach as far landward as it is. There are a number of studies that were generated through scientists in the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Dr. Aubrey and others, who did a considerable amount of study down in this area here. And they had done a study that showed that Pomponetset Beach in the past had actually been all the way down to about this location here at one point in time. Like the Chatham Barrier Beach that Dr. Geis had determined works on a cycle, approximately 140-year cycle, this also at one time had worked on a cycle. This Barrier Beach had gone past this landform here. It had migrated landward, it had welded itself onto this shoreline here, and then began the spit process again. But this barrier now is obviously migrating considerably landward. There's been several breaches in this location here. They've armored this shoreline because of that concern. Just recently, there was a small beach nourishment project here. It was really the results of a dredging project that took place in the tidal channel by the codfish, the Barnstable County's dredge, which that Barnstable County dredge is really paying for itself. It has done a number of beach nourishment projects, really taking compatible material that's ended up in our tidal inlets, and they take that material and they put it on primarily publicly eroding beaches. They just finished a job out in Chatham, actually. But those reports are available through the Oceanographic Institution, talking about all these processes that I had just mentioned to you. Again, here's another postcard. It was undated, but it was obviously somewhere around the turn of the century. This is Humrock Beach in the town of Scituate. This is Fourth Cliff, a drumlin. This is one of the last remaining sediment sources to this beach. But we've developed many of our very vulnerable landforms. This is what it looked like, and I would suggest around the turn of the century. This is what it looked like just several years ago. We completely developed it. It's obviously a winter profile. Some sand does come back, but not a lot of sand. They've armored all the updrift drumlins. First cliff, second cliff, third cliff, and half of fourth cliff are now armored. So the sediment supply to this beach has been significantly cut off. The Corps of Engineers did an analysis about 5 or 6 years ago on what to do here. They're repeatedly damaged during coastal storms. It's eroding. They looked at armoring the entire Barrier Beach, which under the wetlands protection regulations would be extremely difficult. They'd have to go through a variance process and then not knowing clear what the outcome would be. But it was approximately $20 million to armor all of these properties. They looked at buying all the properties out. It was astronomical. It was even more than $20 million to buy them all out. What they decided to do was a beach nourishment project. The beach nourishment project was approximately $6.5 million. Unfortunately, the residents at the time were a little concerned about the requirement. If they had taken the 75% match from the federal government to do this project, they would have been required to provide an enhanced level of public access to these beaches, and they were a little concerned about that, so they declined the beach nourishment project. I think that was very unfortunate. A couple of years later, they did go back to the Corps of Engineers. They changed their mind, but it was too late at that point to get into the cycle within the next several years anyway. But this is what Humrock Beach looks like from the air as well. And one of the reasons why I wanted to show this is because I wanted to trigger a thought in my mind about tidal inlets. Tidal inlets can be flood-dominated or ebb-dominated. Flood-dominated tidal inlet really means that a lot of the sediment that's in the system is being pushed into the inlet. The Chatham Inlet, for example, the breach that occurred in 1987, that system was a flood-dominated inlet, which I'll show you in a minute. But you can see up here, this is the mouth of the North River. This is the North River that continues up through 6 communities. This is the South River here, traveling through Marshfield. And you can see these sandy lobes on either side of the tidal inlet, indicating that it was probably a flood-dominated inlet, taking the little bit of sand that's coming down in the system and getting trapped in that tidal inlet itself. This area here, Wrexham Beach, was actually the mouth of this river. This was a spit at one time. Before the Portland Gale of 1898, this was actually connected to the mainland up there, and this was the tidal inlet down here. Since the 1600s, this was actually the tidal inlet, had flip-flop back and forth, at least 3 documented times that we know of. And I've began a dune profiling program in this Barrier Beach here because I'm a little concerned about this little salt marsh starting to creep up on the back. So should be pretty fascinating to continue looking at that. But speaking of flood-dominated inlets, this is the Chatham Inlet, the breach through Nauset Beach that occurred in January of 1987. This system has been studied extensively, not only by scientists here at the Oceanographic Institution, but others, such as up in Boston University, Duncan Fitzgerald, Dave Aubrey, Graham Geis, and others have done a lot of work to determine what was the cause of the breach in Nauset Beach. This is the Tombolo, or South Beach, that is attached to the Chatham mainland. This is now publicly accessible to be able to walk down. This is the area of the shoreline where a number of houses were lost when the breach first occurred. And I'm going to get into that.
The lighthouse?
And the lighthouse should be right up in this location here, probably right here. But you can drive to the lighthouse. There's a public parking area there and go down the stairs and actually walk out this tombolo and access South Beach now. But I'll tell you, until Ted Keon, the Natural Resources Officer, and Stu Smith, the wharfinger or harbor master down in Chatham, are having a heck of a time trying to keep this flood-dominated inlet open. This is the commercial fishing fleet. This is the Chatham Fish Pier. This is Turn Island. This is the area where they generally deposit the material, but they continually have to try and dredge and try and figure out how they can keep a channel open. It's next to impossible. They're out there, they would like to be out there probably every few months trying to keep that channel open. But that's the problem you have with flood-dominated inlets. But there's a series of reports that are available through the Oceanographic Institution and through the town of Chatham that explain the breach in the Barrier Beach, how it occurred. It didn't occur necessarily from the ocean side. It actually occurred from the landward side. That hydraulic header that I had talked about, one of the mechanisms that forms rip currents, that's actually how the breach actually formed. The barrier was overtopped. The hydraulic inlet that was going down was very inefficient because it was very long and there was a buildup of hydraulic head. And as a result, it burst through from the landward side and created that inlet. I would suggest that we are significantly increasing the financial susceptibility of our structures along the shoreline. This is White Horse Beach in the town of Plymouth. You can see that when structures are destroyed, what goes back in their place are very, very nice homes. But at the same time, we're elevating them. We're elevating them on open pilings. We're actually required to elevate structures on open pilings in velocity zones under both the State Building Code and the National Flood Insurance Program requirements. Every coastal community in the Commonwealth participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. But under the State Building Code and the NFIP, you're required to elevate structures on pilings so that the lowest horizontal structural member is above the 100-year flood elevation. What the 100-year flood elevation is basically the elevation of the storm waves that are anticipated, that there's a 1% chance of hitting in any given year. And those 100-year flood elevations are available in the flood insurance studies and flood insurance rate maps for every coastal community in the Commonwealth. But we are significantly increasing our financial liability along the shore, but hopefully balancing that out with some of the required construction practices along the shoreline. And why do we go to the shoreline? Well, there's a number of reasons why I and everybody else go to the shoreline, and one of them is here. This was the Gloucester Times after the October 1991 storm. A perilous sight, but what a view. The aesthetics, the view. In addition to that, Soundings did a study in 1994, I believe, and they determined that proximity to waterfront adds approximately 30% to the value of property, above all the other factors, well above all the other factors that they looked at. How ironic that we would want to live as close to the shoreline as we can possibly get. And that's where you'll find the most expensive and valuable real estate. But also the aesthetics, the relaxation. I don't know anybody who wouldn't want to exchange seats with this person on a Sunday morning, drinking your cup of coffee and drinking that junk novel that we all want to get to at some point in time. So we've got the view, we've got the value of the property, we've got the aesthetics and the value, and this is what results. Many of the summer homes that we saw years ago are now converted to winter homes. Does anybody know where this is? I took this about 2 years ago. Aha, somebody lives there. This is Nantasket Beach in the town of Hull. And this also formed from that same process. This is a drumlin here, and there's another drumlin up there. And it's one of the theories of the formation of barrier beaches is that longshore sediment transport process. But through spit accretion, it attached to these drumlins, as it did in Gurnett Point, as it did in Saquesh, as it did in the beach. That was the result of us wanting to live along the shore for whatever reason, for a lot of reasons that attract me to want to live near the shore. We have to plan. We have to plan and we have to regulate the shore for a variety of reasons. One of the most notable suites of planning and regulatory criteria in Massachusetts are the Wetlands Protection Regulations. The Wetlands Protection Regulations just list all the coastal resources: land under the ocean, coastal beaches, dunes, barrier beaches, salt marshes, coastal banks, and so forth. And they've determined what are the beneficial functions that these landforms provide. The beneficial functions being storm damage prevention, flood control, protection of groundwater, prevention of pollution, and so forth. So we have standards by which we're required to live now. For example, if you're going to build a house in a dune, The dune has to go on open pilings to allow that dune to function, to allow those aeolian sands to not only blow from the beach up, but to blow from the landward side over the tops of the dunes to help those dunes maintain their stability and allow them to provide their beneficial functions of storm damage prevention, flood control, wildlife habitat, and so forth. Wetlands protection regulations. The Cape Cod Commission's regional policy plan, if you haven't had the pleasure of reading that, that's probably one of the most cutting-edge planning tools that I've read. I worked for the Cape Cod Commission for a year before I came to the Hui Sea Grant program. It is really cutting edge. What I mean by cutting edge is they have taken the science, all the science that I just explained to you, and they have put it into their regional policy plan as far as looking at eroding shorelines, factoring in sea level rise, and then looking at the beneficial functions of these landforms as the wetlands regs do. But the regional policy plan really goes a step further than that and factors in all the science that they could obtain from people from here, the Oceanographic Institution and elsewhere, and have put it into their regional policy plan, which is a plan that is required to be adopted by all the communities on Cape Cod and then applied to all new and reconstructed development in these sensitive areas. The basis for all planning and regulatory criteria are public safety. This is Spring Hill Beach in the town of Sandwich after that December 1992 storm. The basis is based on science, but the principal human factors are public safety and public health. This is Peggotty Beach in the town of Scituate, that same area that I keep showing where the waves inundate and so forth. Well, this is part of the septic system here. And I was taking some of the high-level state officials for a tour of the shoreline to see some of the damage that had occurred. And there was actually somebody down inside there with a bucket taking the sand out of the system here. So you have to ask yourself, many of the shoreline areas are sewered. Many of them are not. Where are the septic systems? What does that actually mean for shoreline waters? If they're on an open ocean shoreline, dilution may keep the waters perceptibly clean. But what about the salt ponds and some of the estuaries and bays that are not necessarily flushed as well? Where are these septic systems and what does that mean? Title V, the suite of regulations that govern the placement of septic systems in Massachusetts, was revised just several years ago. One of the strongest components of Title V, at least for immediate shoreline areas, is there's a prohibition now for septic systems to be placed in the foredune area of velocity zones. Again, the velocity zone is that part of the coastal floodplain that can support greater than a 3-foot wave under 100-year storm conditions. So in other words, it's a high energy area. So they've prohibited any new septic systems or expansions of them in V zones of dunes, which certainly that area is. This is going over to the western shore of Buzzards Bay in the town of Mattappoisett, Cove Road. All of these houses, like Peggotty Beach, were on solid foundations before Hurricane Bob hit in August of 1991. There were 29 structures along this beach that were totally destroyed or washed off their foundations, and several others had to come down because the pilings weren't embedded deep enough and the pilings had tilted. But 29 houses were totally destroyed and washed off the beach. There's a grandfathering clause generally for all regulatory and planning criteria. In other words, those who had built their houses long before the promulgation of these regulations. There's a legal and fairness issue here. So there's a grandfathering clause that oftentimes we try to accommodate the folks to allow them to rebuild in the same footprint, particularly if you're in a hazardous or dangerous area such as a V zone of a barrier beach or dune. Oftentimes you can rebuild, but only to the same footprint of the pre-storm conditions. But you can see this is Cove Road. All the houses went back up on these concrete pilings. I was pretty astounded to see the different types of construction practices along the north and south shore as opposed to the Buzzards Bay area. Oftentimes along the south shore and the north shore we see wooden-driven piles and the houses on top of those. But for some reason down in the Buzzards Bay, it's often cord concrete columns with rebar. But the first couple of houses that went in actually went in with concrete foundations, approximately 4 feet or less below the surface. And what do you do in a case like this? This is not a sewered area. So what do you do in a case like this? As the people were coming in for applications to rebuild their houses, many of the top-level state officials just stopped and gasped and said, how can we allow people to put septic systems back in areas that we know, even during a moderate storm, are going to get destroyed? Because they had to come in and they had to mound the systems because the groundwater is too high. So you're going to mound a system, In other words, create an artificial dune, but have a concrete structure inside of it. They didn't know what to do. This fairness clause, these people had been here for decades, long before the promulgation of the regulations. So somebody came up with a creative idea. They said, well, what if we put the septic tanks in the houses? And that's what happened. The first couple of houses that went in, they actually did go in the ground, and then they put the brakes on. And they said, it's irresponsible for us to allow that to happen. So they went to negotiations, and negotiations resulted in the septic systems being placed in the houses, and the gravel pack leaching trenches were allowed to be put in the beach, which is relatively compatible to many of the barrier beaches that we see along the North Shore, South Shore, Buzzards Bay, and some of the areas of Cape Cod. That there's gravel intermixed with the sands themselves. And you can see this little stovepipe here, this little PVC pipe here in this area here. So it's a compromise, but a compromise I think that was met in relative fairness. So now we've talked about some of the hard armoring structures. The vertical concrete seawalls that were built here in the town of Marshfield between the 30s and 50s actually as retaining walls, not as seawalls. Some of the sand that went in to build these walls, I found out just recently, actually came from the beach. They're deteriorating from the inside out. They're spalling. They're starting to fall apart. It's a very serious condition here, particularly in the towns of Marshfield and Scituate, where there are miles of these vertical walls. And as they fail, the toe of many of these seawalls are now exposed, meaning there's not much more of the seawall below the surface because of sea level rise, the erosion, and the loss of the sediment supply updrift. What they're doing now is they're building revetments as they collapse. That happens in the town of Hull, it happens in Marshfield. Revetments are riprap structures that are laid up against the surface at an angle. Oftentimes, if the revetments, these big ripraps, are put in certain ways, they actually break up the wave energy because of the pore space between the rocks. They'll break up the wave energy much more so than hitting a vertical concrete seawall. But sometimes I wonder, and I went out and I photographed this particular structure here. Now these are all the vertical concrete seawalls, and here's the revetment. I can only guess that the revetment was too tight, that the rocks were put too close together. Oftentimes you'll see for aesthetic purposes or for safety purposes of people walking down the revetment, they'll put chink stone in between the rocks or try to get the riprap as close as possible. I'm not an engineer. I'm speaking this only from observations, but I think there should be a lot of pore space between the riprap, and of course riprap has to be appropriately sized. But what they did was they actually made a ramp here, which caused a lot of overtopping and a lot of complaints from the people who live behind that revetment. They want the revetment removed, and they want the vertical concrete seawall back. So we've talked about the big hard structures, the seawalls, the revetments, and so forth. Now in the quiet estuaries and bays and so forth, generally what you'll see is bulkheads. This is a wooden bulkhead. We were on a site review. They wanted to replace this with the larger structure. But a bulkhead is really a retaining structure. It's retaining the earth behind it. It's not subjected to significant wave activity, so you'll find these up in the upper reaches of the bays and the estuaries. But are there impacts from these bulkheads? It's probably retaining some material from these bluffs, probably very little material, but the sandy material is coming from somewhere. But there's not very much erosion of these bluffs here. But again, the use impacts in front of these sometimes. This is 10 and 50 and so forth. But if you take the 100-year still water elevation, if you take a cross-section of a dune, dissect it down the top, take the 100-year still water elevation and draw it in the dune. If this frontal dune reservoir, this volume of sand, is greater than 540 square feet, through field observations, actual field observations and dune measuring pre and post storm, as well as laboratory exercises, FEMA has adopted through the flood insurance program as a result of scientific research that this dune should withstand the 100-year storm. And they're using this dune erosion modeling to calculate their flood insurance rates for coastal communities now. The town of Sandwich is the only flood insurance maps I know that has incorporated the 540 square foot rule. Scituate, Marshfield, and Duxbury are undergoing that study presently. So after you put in, this was the sacrificial dune that was put in the town of Duxbury, on Duxbury Beach. They went back and they put in grasses. But you notice, this is in a herringbone pattern. You notice the dune is very low lying. Well, we have this little guy here. This is the piping plover, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. But the reason why this was left bare in this herringbone pattern, because it's an endangered species habitat. So there was a compromise met between the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program of the state and those who wanted to build a dune much bigger to help prevent overtopping of waves and the effects on the shoreline on the mainland area of Duxbury, the compromise was met that they would do a dune between a 6 and 10 to 1 slope to allow the little critters to get up and over from the intertidal area back to the bayside area to feed and to be able to traverse and be able to make it. So they did this, and you still see the remnants of this herringbone pattern today. The dune has grown significantly. There's probably another 10 to 20 feet of the dune that has grown up out in front of that, but we haven't really seen a very significant storm either since the December 1992 storm. There have been a lot of minor or moderate storms. We haven't really seen a very significant storm, but it was a very successful project, and it allowed them to not only build a dune, but it allowed them to maintain the endangered species habitat as well. This is Ballston Beach in the town of Truro. Just by using sand fencing alone, snow fencing or sand fencing alone, this is the third fence. There's two fences that are actually buried underneath that. If you have an adequate sediment supply coming from your updrift areas and the grain size is compatible, by just sand fencing alone, for vegetation it would probably build much faster as well, but sand fencing alone will build up significant volumes of sand. This is what it looked like after December 1992. This is that same area. This is the Pamet River, the head of the Pamet River. There was concerns about septic systems and drinking water wells that were on the Pamet River side, that they were going to be inundated with salt and therefore would be non-functioning. So they did an analysis, they did a study, and they came back, and just by simply putting sand fencing up there because of the volume of material that's still on that system, it's highly successful. There's a person right here. I wish it were me. I wanted to mention very briefly this. There have been a number of creative erosion control technologies that have been attempted that I've seen in Massachusetts, and I'm sure hundreds elsewhere. But one of the ones most notable now has been installed on the eastern shore of Nantucket. It's called the Stay Beach face dewatering system. It's approximately a $2.5 million project on the eastern shore of Nantucket. And if you've been to the eastern shore of Nantucket, you'll know it's spectacularly beautiful, and the houses up on the bluffs are worth quite a bit of money. This is Low Beach, just almost down on the southeast side of Nantucket. What the Stay Beach system did was, it's a series of perforated pipes that are embedded in the beach. They're run by electric pumps. There's electric pumps that, when you have the swash, which is that part of the wave that washes up the beach after the wave breaks, when the swash goes up to the beach, it generally percolates down into the sand and then goes back down very slowly, or backwashes immediately, depending on the porosity of the sand. But what they did was they put these perforated pipes, hooked them up to electrical systems, pumps and so forth, and installed discharge pipes. So when the swash swashes up the beach, it creates a negative pressure, and it sucks the water down immediately into these pipes. And when it sucks the water down immediately, any sand that's entrained as the wave washes up the beach drops on the beach immediately, rather than gets washed back down with the backwash. That's the theory of the project. Washes up, there's sand in it, washes back, the sand goes back down, and it moves down the shore in that longshore drift, that longshore sediment transport pattern. Well, this takes the sand and just drops it immediately in place. And the theory being it should help build up the beach, or at least slow the erosion rate. There were 3 discharge pipes that went along probably about 2 miles. There are actually 3 systems along probably about 2 miles. Unfortunately, it's not working that well. I think there may be some merit to the system in the right location. At the eastern shore of Nantucket, there's a 4 to 5 knot current offshore. The erosion rate since the 1950s to 1970 is approximately 10 to 12 feet per year on average. It was a little bit of a tough site to install the system, and I just think they may have probably tried a different location. But these houses, there were actually 4 rows of houses that extended out over the last several decades, and they're slowly losing these houses. But if you look at the shoreline change analysis that was done at the Cesium office when I was there, we did a shoreline change analysis. If you looked at the long-term shoreline change rate for this particular area, it shows that it's accreting. And the reason it shows that it's accreting is from the mid-1800s to 1950, there was a massive accretion. And at some time in the 1950s, at least based on the aerial photographs that we used, sometime around the 1950s, that trend reversed. And it's been eroding ever since. But the bias that was created by that long period of time, that long accretion period, overwhelmed the statistics and showed that this area, statistically over that long period, that one number you come up with, that average number per year, showed that it's accreting. Just a little lesson in looking at shoreline change data. If somebody says to you, oh, the area is eroding at 2 feet per year, ask them what the numbers are in between. Like, it could have eroded, it could have accreted. If you come down to Nantucket and you go around to the south corner, just around the southeast corner here, you'll see there's an area down there called Low Beach that annually could fluctuate 100 feet. In fact, they were going to extend the sewer beds on the southeast corner of Nantucket because it had accreted something like 200 feet. While they were in the planning process of putting these sewer beds in, they had lost 100 feet within 10 months. So if you look at the shoreline change rate for those transects, it shows that the area is stable, but it's moving 200 feet at a time back and forth. So just a little lesson in looking at shoreline change data. Ask to look at what the intervening numbers are to arrive at that long-term rate. It's very important. As I had mentioned, this is Dave Valley from the National Weather Service on a tour. As I had mentioned, what we do now is require houses to be on pilings above the flood elevation, the 100-year flood elevation, above the waves, to allow the waves to cascade under the house. Hopefully that provides some measure of protection. The concern is that many people stay in their houses now thinking that they're safe. I didn't have enough room in my slide tray to show you some of the pilings that had snapped off during some of these storms, and the loss of the material under the house as well. But it's we're trying to arrive at a compromise. We're trying to arrive at a balance between allowing people who had lived there for many, many decades, if not hundreds of years, to continue to occupy the house as long as it's safe and as long as they're not diminishing the beneficial functions of these landforms that in turn affect other people. What do we do with all this information now? Now, what do scientists do with all this information? Let's just use a quick scenario. This is Duxbury Beach. I've showed it a number of times. This is Gurnet Point at Drumlin, Saquich Head at Drumlin, another Barrier Beach connecting these. The source for this material was coming from these two drumlins here, another drumlin here, but this is, okay, so you see Duxbury Beach. People have occupied this drumlin here, Gurnet Point. People have occupied Saquich Head as well as the intervening Barrier Beach here. They would have occupied this entire Barrier Beach. It had been subdivided in the early part of the century. Fortunately, a non-profit organization had bought the beach. But take a look at that configuration. Now what some scientists did, or some professors up at Boston University, is they were asked to look at the system simplistically and just do a little bit of little analysis. So here we are again. This is the Barrier Beach. This is the Drumlin, Gurnet Point, and Saquich Head. What they did was they looked at everything I had just described to you. They looked at the longshore transport direction, how much sand was moving at the system. They looked at the shoreline change rates. They looked at the overwash areas. They looked at some of the offshore bathymetry as well and looked at the way the waves were changing as a result of the offshore bathymetry. And they made a calculated, educated guess based on all the information they could find. And what they determined is that this little thin area here, remember that boulder platform I had showed you initially in the slideshow at that drumlin? The boulder platform, as that drumlin continues to erode, that boulder platform gets bigger. As it gets bigger in linear extent, it breaks up the wave energy and slows the erosion naturally of this drumlin. As it slows the erosion, it diminishes the sediment supply to this beach and to this beach as well. So what they're suggesting is, because of that diminishment of supply, you may end up with a breach in this particular location here. Time 2, again, for the same reasons. Diminishment of sediment supply, it may breach in this location, so you may end up with 2 islands, but ultimately there is still some sand coming down here. This will connect, and Gurnet Point will become an island. I did this presentation before the Homeowners Association out in Saquich. And I suggested that they may have to look at a ferry system at some point in the system, and the reaction was entertaining. I think they wanted to throw me out. Very quickly, just something else that Dr. Geis here at the Oceanographic Institution and others, they just went back and looked at some of the old charts back to the 1700s and looked at how the system of Nauset Beach, that long Barrier Beach that I had showed you before, Nauset Beach being here, in Monomoy Island here, well, they went back and they just looked at all these processes as well. Back to look at old charts, old area photographs, and they sort of recreated the history. And they recognized a 140-year pattern in the evolution of this beach. The Chatham Breach that occurred in 1987, that wreaked havoc out there. Actually, that same process occurred about approximately 140 years ago. And if you look at the break in the location in Nauset Beach here, Monomoy Island, mainland of Chatham, here's the Chatham Fish Pier right here in Pleasant Bay. They suggested that a breach may occur in this particular location here. And if you look, 1985 to 1995 was when that was suggested. If you look up here between 1830 and 1850, you see the same pattern. So they recognize a pattern of the sand movement, of the migration of that Barrier Beach. And sure enough, in 1987, we ended up with this breach. But shame on him, he didn't get it in the right location. He suggested it was going to occur somewhere up in here, but it actually occurred down here. But it just lends a little validity to just sort of understanding these fundamental principles and going back and looking at old charts and aerial photographs and sediment transport. The information is valuable if it's put into a planning context. He predicted that that was going to occur 10 years before it actually occurred, simply by going in the past and looking at these coastal processes. There's a lot of value in looking at these processes, but the value comes in getting that information out to the public, out to the planners, out to the regulators, out to the waterfront property owners, so that they can at least anticipate and make wise, informed choices. So in summary, I think where we're at in shoreline management and shoreline planning is really a balance. It's a balance between a number of competing interests. One of them, allowing people to enjoy their shoreline property, at least as long as possible, to enjoy their property, but ensuring that by the use of that shoreline property, that they're at least maintaining the beneficial functions of these landforms that I just explained for us and for future generations to continue to enjoy. And I would ask you the question, through our planning and through our regulatory process, through our actions of using these coastal landforms, are we sustaining the beneficial functions of these landforms? From my observations, I have an answer, but mine are observations. I've worked with conservation commissioners, I've walked the shoreline, but I don't, quantitatively, I can't answer that question. So as a result, Dr. Geist, when he worked for the Hui Sea Grant program, he just retired recently, through the Coastal Landform Management Conference, he came up with the concept. Why don't we answer that question? Why don't we attempt to answer the question? Through all the regulations that we have, through our own activities, these armoring, the relocation of the structures, are we sustaining the beneficial functions of these landforms? Because if we're not, I think we need to know that, and I think we need to know that right away so we can at least plan for the future in some way. So he began a process called the Landform Sustainability Project. And what we're doing now is the Hui Sea Grant program. I've taken the project over from Graham. So between the Hui Sea Grant program, in partnership with the Cape Cod Commission and several Cape Cod communities, and hopefully this year we'll get all the Cape Cod communities, to look at the decisions that we've made. Not as a report card, not to say whether somebody's doing the right decision or wrong decision, but what we're doing is we're looking at the decisions primarily under the wetlands regulations. Somebody comes in for a seawall project, somebody comes in to relocate their structure. What we're doing is we have a series of questions that we worked out over the past year to see whether or not we were doing the right thing with 4 towns on the Cape, with Truro, with Brewster, with Falmouth and Eastham. And we went through this process, and now we're going to launch into the full project this year to determine, are we sustaining our coastal landforms? Are we maintaining the beneficial functions? And hopefully we're going to have that answer for you by next year, after this next process. So in the meantime, recognize where we are and what we're dealing with, but go to the beach often and enjoy it. Thank you. Not hard ones, though.
How practical are man-made fishing reefs as a structure for changing the high energy waves to low energy? Say an example of one off the Fresh River, one off the Trunk River, and keeping all the materials from coming back into the river and causing the problems they cause later on, piling up the sediment. Besides the fact that they're increase the habitat for marine organisms and fish and whatnot.
So,
These type reefs, is this a possibility? Or is it
you're talking about an offshore breakwater or a submerged breakwater, for example? There was one. There's an experimental one down off the coast of New Jersey now called the Beach Saver device. But in general, what an offshore breakwater would do, or even a submerged breakwater will do, that was actually, the one in New Jersey I think is a little odd because it was installed within a groin cell. A little bit different. If you're talking about something like off the Trunk River, off the south side of the Cape, what breakwaters generally do is they will generally cause a quiescent area landward of the breakwater, and they'll generally end up with a buildup of sand landward of the breakwater. In some cases, if it's designed properly. They looked at offshore breakwaters in the town of Scituate when the Corps of Engineers did their alternatives analysis. That was more than $20 million to put in a breakwater. It's expensive, And I'll get to your answer. It's very expensive. It requires a lot of maintenance. It oftentimes will build up sand in the lee of it. So if you're talking about off the Trunk River, it may actually clog up the Trunk River. It interrupts the longshore sediment transport by creating a quiet area behind the breakwater. So you'll generally get some type of buildup, a tombolo type effect, they call it. So it can work. But at the same time, you're going to be interrupting that longshore sediment transport process. You're going to be sort of robbing the sand from downdrift areas. And it's critical in how you build it. There was an experiment done down in, I think it was Palm Beach in Florida, I think it was, where they built a breakwater a little bit too close to the shore, and it created that hydraulic head that I mentioned about a rip current, and it actually backfired and caused a lot more erosion than it had been designed to do. But they have worked on occasion. There's the Five Sisters breakwaters off of Winthrop. They're building up sand in the lee of those breakwaters. The downdrift areas, because they're working so well, are suffering. And the maintenance expense and the initial costs nowadays are just, the cost benefit really doesn't work out. It's really cost prohibitive. I hope that answers your question. But you know, they're great for artificial reefs, I guess, but you'd have to talk to my counterpart, the biologist.
Well, to follow up with this question, then, what do you suggest to protect those river mountains?
Like the ones along the south side, like Trunk River? What would I suggest? Boy, I see them down there with their front-end loaders. After every moderate blow, in fact, every time I drive there, I looked this morning and I saw it was Trunk River was filling up again. What would you suggest? What would I suggest? Just off the top of my head, that would be really dangerous for me to do right now because I'd be held to it. But I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. You know, what I would want to do is I would want to look, and I can't answer your question because I would want to look at the volume of sand that's coming along the system. A lot of times the tidal prism, you know, the difference of water between low and high tide, that has to be sufficient based on the cross-sectional area to be able to push the sand out. Sometimes you just don't have that. If the tidal prism of the pond isn't enough to keep that thing flushed out under any cross-sectional area, I think you end up with the front-end loader syndrome. You're just going to be on call. I don't know. I'm not really sure. I'd have to really look at the system. And not just me. I think somebody who can quantitatively model it would really have to look at it. I don't know what they did. I don't know whether they studied it before they put those little inlets in along there. But again, the volume of transport, the cross-sectional area, and the tidal prism would all have to be modeled to determine whether you have any cross-sectional area that might work. But you know, somebody could look at it. Do you have the money? I'm sure we could find some scientists who would love to take it on. I'm sorry.
You were emphasizing putting vegetation on land to stabilize the coastal banks. What about submerged vegetation on the water side that would cause more sedimentation and decrease the currents of wave action?
In the right location, I think that will be highly successful. You know, you won't, but you don't get your submerged aquatic vegetation in substrates that are exposed to high energy, high wave activity, and that's generally where you'll find most of the damage. But in some of the, Bliss Point, for example, in Barnstable, I mean, anywhere where you'll see a little bit of a salt marsh offshore, or even some eelgrass beds, oftentimes you'll see a little bit of, again, that buildup of sand landward of it. It can work, provided you're in an area that doesn't have very high energy, and the root systems have enough time to take. But yeah, it can work.
You've given a very practical talk, and you've given a talk that has dollar figures, but I'm interested in the form that I see when I walk along Brewster over in the Bay or over in Chatham on the south shore. You go along there and there are waves of sand. You see bed forms where the low tide is going out, and none of your pictures have that. You want to comment on that particular form that sand makes? The ripple patterns of the sand.
Primarily based on water flow. It's primarily based on currents.
Usually water flow at low tide you see them.
Right.
And they can be, from Brewster, 7 or 8 or 9 beaches out, if I'm using the proper term. And certainly where the current is going, there are ripples that may be foot or 2 feet apart. Very dominant feature.
Right. That happens to be a depositional site in that curvature where the Brewster Flats, Brewster Eastham Flats. But the ripples are generally formed from the movement of water, basically the tidal currents.
Are they
The sand moving.
replicas of how the waves were above them?
Not necessarily. Not
What
necessarily.
causes those patterns?
I believe, well, the combination of currents and waves, I believe. Just currents and waves.
Maybe I'm just talking aesthetics instead of sedimentary physics.
Yeah. The ripple patterns and mega ripples and small ripples are generally, if not always, created by water flow, generally tidal currents or wind-generated currents, and a combination of them with waves. It's just, that's how they form. And if you look at the shape of them, like the drumlins, the wheelback formations, if you look at the shapes of the ripples, you can actually tell which way the currents were moving that formed those ripples. You'll have the stoss on the lee side. The stoss is the steep side, and the lee is the very gentle side. Same thing with drumlins. They have a stoss and a lee side, and that will tell you the general movement of the glaciers. That will tell you the general movement of the current, or the water action that actually laid that down. I don't know what to do with.
There's a lot of politics involved with the shoreline management from state to state and region to region, and I was just wondering, is there enough political cooperation to really preserve things and to do what is right?
Boy, that's a loaded question, isn't it? Politics doesn't enter into shoreline management. No.
The reason I ask is I'm an owner of a small piece of property in New Hampshire, and I asked for a permit to be granted to put in some head-sized stone to prevent clay from washing into what amounts to be Great Bay, which is a tidal estuary project for Portsmouth up. And I was thwarted by 6 different agencies because none of them could agree. So I ended up not being able to do anything but spending $1,200 for permit application.
That's something I'd have to talk to you about after this. But there had to be some reason that they could base on their regulatory constraints, or you could have appealed it and won. But they had to articulate.
There was coastal zone management, the town conservation, Army Corps of Engineers, etc. And on and on.
Yeah, there had to be a basic fundamental reason why they said no to you, and they would have had to have related. They would have had to have related that in writing based on what their regulatory and planning constraints were. They had to have done that.
I was just stalemated, and only 2 organizations said no.
And the others. This sounds like.
Conservation people said no, and the coastal zone management people said no. But the Army Corps of Engineers just kind of, it just drifted. And I reappealed, and no decision was reached. I'm still waiting.
By the Corps of Engineers, but you were denied by the Conservation Commission in the Coastal Zone Management Office. What happens in Massachusetts, and I'm not answering your question actually, but what happens here is that if an applicant comes in for a permit to build a seawall, for example, or a revetment, I'll use Nantucket just as an example. They have local bylaws. The local conservation commissions, which every community in the Commonwealth has a conservation commission, their job is to uphold the state wetlands protection regulations, but they also have to uphold the local bylaw. There's a 2-tier process there. So they could approve you, they might be forced to approve you on the state wetlands regulations, but their local bylaw might be more stringent. In the case of Nantucket, their bylaw is much more stringent. So they can approve you on the state level, but they might have to deny you on the local level. I mean, it's not necessarily politics, it's sort of the will of the people. That's what put the bylaw in, hopefully based on some scientific principles. Because if it's not based on scientific principles or public health and safety, then they can't win in a court of law. But unfortunately, that might cost you a lot of money to prove.
I would have to take it to court.
Yeah. I found myself in that dilemma recently, and I didn't have the will nor the finances to go to court, and I just accepted the decision, although I didn't agree with it. It sounds like something we'd have to discuss beyond this.
About, cooperation, and
I don't know how to answer your question. Unfortunately.